We will carry out orders given by the government of India on Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and we are ready. This statement by the Indian Army's Northern Commander has put the spotlight back on PoK. Is India actually ready to take PoK? Remember, you're up against one of the largest standing armies in the world. Is this militarily feasible? What diplomatic consequences could it invite? Is this just grandstanding? Or does the Indian Army actually think that this is a real possibility?
Forcing invaders away barely months after independence and in the wake of Kashmir acceding to India. A line of control divided the region. A part of it became Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Another war in 1965. A third conflict, 34 years later in Kargil, India repulses the attackers again. Fast forward to the Modi era.
As far as the Indian Army is concerned, Indian Army will carry out any order which is being given by the government of India. And whenever such orders are given, we'll always be ready for it.
India turns assertive about the territory in Pakistan's illegal occupation.
कश्मीर और लद्दाख का क्षेत्र आज सामान्य प्रदेशों से कहीं अधिक रफ्तार से प्रगति के रास्ते पर है। यह प्रदेश एक के बाद एक विकास की नई ऊंचाइयां छू रहा है। पर मैं यहां कहना चाहूंगा कि अभी तो हमने इस इलाके के डेवलपमेंट का आगाज भर किया है। अभी तो हमने उत्तर दिशा की ओर चलना प्रारंभ कर दिया है। हमारी यात्रा तो तब पूरी होगी जब हम 22 फरवरी 1949 को भारतीय संसद में सर्वसम्मत पारित हुए प्रस्ताव को अमल में लाएंगे और उसके अनुरूप हम अपने बाकी बचे हिस्से जैसे गिलगित और बाल्टिस्तान तक पहुंचेंगे।
When the Modi government revoked Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir, it took an unambiguous stance on PoK as well.
इसलिए एग्रेसिव हूं कि जम्मू एंड कश्मीर के पीओके को आप भारत का हिस्सा नहीं मानते हो क्या? एग्रेसिव ना हो, जान दे देंगे इसके लिए। क्या बात कर रहे हो आप? एग्रेसिव होने की क्या बात कर रहे हो?
When Congress was in power in 1994, the Parliament passed a resolution declaring Pakistan vacate parts of Jammu and Kashmir under its occupation. Earlier this year, BJP and RSS leaders marked that 1994 resolution as Sankalp Divas.
A unanimous resolution passed by this very House accepted that Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of the India, and that is the final position. If at all there is an issue, it is only that of how to retrieve back the part of Jammu and Kashmir which continues to remain under illegal occupation of Pakistan even after so many years. Now that is the only left agenda. उसके बाद तो बहस की गुंजाइश नहीं रह जाती.
The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh has long been proponent of Akhand Bharat, the idea of an undivided India spread across the subcontinent, the Kashmir region in its entirety included. The RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat believes it's achievable in the next couple of decades. India's stated position on Kashmir in totality emphasized for a physical jurisdiction over PoK more forcefully than ever before. Bureau Report, India Today.
Taking back Taiwan is a critical part of Beijing's overall strategic mission. These repeated comments coming from senior Indian officials, are they suggesting a change in stance where taking back PoK, which is backed by a parliamentary resolution, becomes a key part of India's strategic objectives? Is it even possible? Remember, the Chinese military enjoys overwhelming dominance over the Taiwanese army and air force. The Indian army is superior to the Pakistani army, but not quite by the same magnitude. So is it militarily possible? Imagine for a moment you're joining me in the war room's operational room of take for example the Northern Army Command. If these orders were to come from Army headquarters in Delhi, can it actually be executed on the ground? Without getting into specific details of the battle action plan, what could such an order entail? Let's spend a moment talking about, we're not advocating war, we're just assessing whether or not taking back Pakistan-occupied Kashmir militarily is even feasible, which is something clearly being discussed because you've had the defense minister say it, you've now had Lieutenant General Upendra Dwivedi, the Northern Army commander say it. So let's spend a moment thinking about whether this is possible. Joining me on this broadcast is Lieutenant General Ata Hasnain, former General Officer commanding 15 Corps. If such an operation were required, and if he were still in 15 Corps, a lot of his troops would be involved in an operation of this nature. We have with us on this broadcast also Major General G.D. Bakshi, leading defense expert. He spends a lot of time wargaming different options. He seems to believe this is possible. He'll hopefully try and explain why. Ajay Shukla thinks this is a completely cuckoo idea and can't possibly be done, or he'll try and explain what his objections with army commanders speaking in this fashion really are. So will Saikat Datta. He's a journalist, CEO currently of Newstrack, spends a lot of time thinking and writing about national defense policy. And we've got Major Manik Jolly. He's a retired officer and a defense expert. So let me go across to General G.D. Bakshi first. If just for a moment we were to simulate a war game, let's imagine for a moment that the political establishment were to ask Army headquarters, which in turn asks the Northern Army Command, to prepare a plan to take back Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And since you spent so much time doing war games, General Bakshi, how would such a war game play out? Do you think that this is militarily possible, given the reality of Pakistan also being a nuclear power? Do you think the Indian Army can go and take back PoK? What would it involve? How would you do it?
Rahul, let me first put it in context. What we are witnessing is a very assertive response by the Indian state, or an attempt by the Indian state to drastically alter the narrative on Jammu and Kashmir.
Sure.
So far we were unduly defensive, we were on the back foot. It was always Pakistan demanding that we vacate, what they called Indian-held Kashmir. And we were, meekly coming out with assertions that showed a weakness of will, the sky is the limit, etc., etc. You remember those, very, very charitable statements emanating. Ever since this government has taken charge, one, we have done away with Article 370, we have done away with 35A, we have ended all ambiguity on India's resolve and will to hold on to Jammu and Kashmir. And the new narrative that is very rightly being crafted is, look, there is no other Kashmir dispute. The only and only problem is when is Pakistan going to vacate illegally occupied PoK?
Sure.
Right? Juridically, we are absolutely in the right. The Maharaja of Kashmir duly acceded to India. It was Mountbatten who tried to foist all sorts of ifs and buts because of their obvious geostrategic interests vis-a-vis Pakistan and Pakistan's role in helping them contain Russia. So I think it's about time we threw ambiguity out of the window and said, this is the new narrative. There is no question of accepting that we will resile from a stand on Kashmir. If there is any issue left, it is only and only when the hell is Pakistan going to get out of PoK. We have made our assertions of will quite patently clear and obvious. Apropos the issue of can we do it, I would rather that, we don't talk of offensive options. Most senior military officers who have held responsible positions would not like to get involved in discussion of live offensive operations. we can do it in only very general terms. Let me tell you that this was war-gamed by the Americans, right? I'm not talking of what we are planning or not planning. Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. Well, period. I mean, let's be very clear on that.
Sure.
These are offensive plans, right? I have served quite often there, so has Ata, my very dear friend. So we have our limitations on this, but I'm discussing with you the Trevor Dupoy war game model for an India-Pakistan conflict in which India goes hell for leather, concentrates most of the strike core elements to the north of the semi-desert terrain and upwards, and we do make a bid to grab in that war game, the American war game, make a bid to grab the whole of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, even as far back in Ravi Rikhi's book, if you remember, on hypothetical fourth round India-Pakistan conflict. It started with a paradrop in a particular portion of Jammu and Kashmir, and those kind of things. So can we do it or not? I would be a little hesitant in that, but we will take that as the
Okay, General
goes on.
Hasnain, we've seen most recently in that war between Russia and Ukraine, in this day and age, taking over enemy territory is not easy. The Russian army far superior to the Ukrainian army, but struggling. We've got China to contend with, which is supposed to be an all-weather friend of Pakistan's. You've got the defense minister and the Northern Army chief, Northern Army commander talking about how this can be done if required. If I were to ask you the same question, without getting into specific tactical plans, just broad strokes, do you think the Indian Army can actually physically take PoK back from Pakistan?
Thank you, Rahul, thank you. And I beg to disagree a little bit with General Giri Bakshi.
Okay.
To the extent that the aspect of offensive operations got introduced hugely into the Indian Army in 2002 after Operation Parakram. And it was before that we were always talking defensively. It's 2002 which opened up the whole narrative and we started talking more offensively. If the ISI is worried, and if the context of our discussion at the moment is the worry which the ISI is expressing, I'm so happy that it is happening. Let me go beyond. This is contingency planning, Rahul. We do contingency planning in military operations all the time. To think that we are going to only sit back and plan defensively and say, this is how we will defend Uri or Poonch or Kupwara if the Pakistanis come in, we are not doing our professional work that we are required to do. We need to have a season in which we will always discuss offensive operations. And I'm in agreement with General Bakshi, we will never discuss it publicly, but we will state it. We have the intent. We cannot go away without the intent of having offensive operations. The Indian Army has to be trained, has to be prepared for it, has to be equipped for it at all times. What General Dwivedi has done is just express a potential contingency that should the government of India demand from the Indian Army to go across and get hold of PoK, the Indian Army is prepared to do it, it's got the plans to do it, it will continue progressing those plans from time to time. Can it successfully do it in the context of what you have asked about the Ukraine-Russian war? One can't say anything about success in conventional ops of this kind. Yes, on 24th of February, we all thought that Russia is going to just wipe out Ukraine, and you know what the situation is today. The situation in PoK is also it's a difficult thing, it's a very difficult terrain. There is enough army, the kind of ratios that we expect of 9:1 in the mountains do not exist there. The Chinese interests in Gilgit-Baltistan obviously also compromise this to a great extent. So there are contingencies and contingencies. What I am very happy about is they are being spoken about. And the message is going to Pakistan, we are not sitting back on our haunches. If push comes to shove, we will make every effort to get back our territory, which we resolved to do so on 22nd of February 1994.
Colonel Shukla, from what I can gather from what both General Bakshi and Ata Hasnain have said, is that don't get into the specifics, look at the principle. Far from talking about what happens to Jammu and Kashmir, the onus is now on whether Pakistan can defend PoK, whether India can go out and take PoK. China has been talking about taking Taiwan. It will be bloody, it will be brutal if it comes to that, but it puts Taiwan under immense pressure. in the same way now, Pakistan comes under a siege mentality. They're wondering whether you've got a Northern Army commander speaking. He's a man in uniform, so he's not some politician just shooting his mouth off. If he's saying something, they start asking the same question, and psychologically it's good to have your enemy on the defensive.
Rahul, the way I look at it is, if we were actually seriously talking about implementing a plan to get back POK, the last thing you would hear is the Army Commander, Northern Command, saying that we have such a plan and we will take over POK whenever we choose to. So I see this as completely a political statement, not a military statement. And a statement that is sort of designed to evoke certain reactions both from within our own electorate and from Pakistan as well. The other thing that we really need to sort of keep in mind is that don't talk about big principle without talking about the detail. You have to talk detail if you want to talk big principle, because otherwise one may not sort of lead to the other. So therefore it is essential to be clear in our minds about how we will take back POK, whether we will take back POK, and the modalities of the same. As far as the military is concerned, I would be uncomfortable with discussing political questions. All the questions which have been discussed so far on your show are not military questions. They are political questions about whether India will go, how India will go, and so on. And that is something which we, especially if we are serious about taking any action against Pakistan, we will not discuss it on TV.
No, so you've been an army man yourself. Let me ask you a question, military. Do you believe militarily the Indian army can go in, formulate a battle plan which allows us to physically take over the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir area?
We can, and this is a purely military assessment of somebody who served as an operations officer in J&K. We can make a plan, we can make a realistic plan, but whether that plan gets implemented or not is a political question. The go-ahead for the implementation is a political question, and to that extent, we might have a plan, but not the will to implement that plan. So far, that's been the case. We are talking about, Rahul, one second. We're talking about earlier no will to take any action or anything of that kind. I would say that, so far there hasn't been too much of action under this government either. There have been 2 strikes that have taken place, but war and taking over POK is a completely different ball game.
Major Manik Jolly, Colonel Shukla arguing that there is a plan but there is no will. Can I counter argue to say that even if there is will, is there a plan that seems strong enough to be able to pull this off? Because remember, unlike the Balakot surgical strikes or the Uri surgical strike, this isn't a limited special forces operation. This involves mountain strike corps. This involves going into someone else's territory which is defended, where the armies are reasonably equally paired, the Indian army superior, but not with the kind of extent required to be able to dominate the enemy in that kind of mountainous terrain. Can such a plan, in your view, be pulled off?
Hi Rahul, thanks and Jai Hind to all the seniors there. I think one thing I'd like to clarify, I really wanted to say on that, when Colonel Shukla said that statement of Northern Army Commander was political, I think on the contrary, that was very military. It's very easy to get pulled into rhetorics and jingoist statements when reporter is asking you what do you think of taking POK. But rather he stated it exactly as a mature general of a large army would, that this is as per the resolution and we will carry out whatever orders are given to us. So I think that was pretty military. Coming back to your question, I think I have very senior officers, the GOCs here, and they know the plans much better. In my limited experience, whatever I understood, it can definitely be pulled off. There is absolutely no doubt. The Indian Army lives on the confidence that, it is not just about making grand statements. The day the order is given, Indian Army will pull it off, and all our generals have created brilliant plans around it. But I would also like to add that the war is now not so much limited to a country versus country kind of a thing. I think if I was sitting there, why India is changing statements, why these POK things are coming, because somehow the situation in the region are maturing where India can talk about it. With Afghanistan happening, then the China is getting pulled into Taiwan, then the pressure on the US, on Iran and China both, then Pakistan imploding itself, the instability in the economy, the political, downfall, the military order, the fight. So if I was looking at it very objectively and I had a checklist of when I should do this, this sounds like a pretty good time. But I still say this is,
okay. So let me build on that with Saikat Datta. Pakistan is in turmoil. Imran Khan is banging the gates of Islamabad. You've got China very clearly obsessed with the idea of taking over Taiwan. At this point in time, you've had multiple military generals and the defense minister talk about this. Are you reading this as a change in strategy? Do you agree with General Bakshi's assertion that you're changing the narrative? We're not talking about what happens to Jammu and Kashmir. You're putting Pakistan in the defensive, talking about going and taking POK, whether you ultimately go out and do it or not. It changes the narrative very dramatically.
Yes, it's just...
thank you, Rahul. I have 4 points to make and I'll be very quick about it. To answer your specific question that have things changed dramatically, I don't think they have. Let me also preface by saying that what the defense minister has said and what the Northern Army commander has said, both of them are perfectly right in what they are saying. The defense minister has reiterated India's historical stance, and as your program mentioned that in 1994 the Indian Parliament also passed a resolution. That is a historical fact, and there is no doubt that India continues to assert its right to illegally occupied Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. What the general has said, the Northern Army commander has been absolutely professional. If any political order is given, the Indian Army prides in the fact that it is under civilian control and it's a professional army. Given any order, it will execute to the best of its ability. But the 4 points that I do want to make is that currently, if you look at the situation, if you look at the Ladakh region, and if you see the Chinese presence, which has dramatically increased post-2020, and you've seen what happened in Galwan, etc. Our reaction to Galwan and our ability to push back the Chinese has not been optimum. And the area which is known as Subsector North has traditionally been held by, it's supposed to be held by a division worth of troops, but usually practically only about a brigade handles that. And post Galwan, we have had to push in more troops and maintain a balance of power to keep the Chinese at bay while we've finished 16 rounds of talks. And yet we have not seen any major change within there. Any planned offensive could very possibly ignite a two-front war. And also remember that there is an illegally ceded territory given by the Pakistanis to the Chinese in POK, which means you are not directly attacking what the Chinese claim and believe is their territory. So you will be looking at a two-front war. Secondly, the program is filled with mostly army generals. But if you were to also bring in another sister service, the Air Force, and you have seen what happened post Balakot, our own troops blew out our own helicopter, and there was an utter confusion there. You also have the example of the Kargil war. Just to vacate those heights, we lost over nearly 500 of our troops. So any offensive in those parts will need tremendous amounts of manpower, because you need a minimum of 9:1 ratio in those parts. Secondly, the second point is that is the Indian Army fully modernized? It will always, you see the men, you cannot doubt our men or our generals. They're tremendous and very professional. But do they have enough equipment? Is their modernization optimum to carry out this kind of an operation? Because any operation here will inevitably lead to all-out war. And if you see what's happening with the Russian tanks in Ukraine and so on and so forth, things will not be very easy. Third is look at the economic climate. You cannot dissociate warfare from the economic climate. The whole world is going into a recession. India is one of the few bright spots within that economic gloom that we are looking at. Do we want to lose out on that at the cost of an all-out war, which will not only exhaust us economically, which will also create all sorts of other things? And finally, if you look at the kind of situation that we are in, there are many options which we could do and create tons and tons of trouble in these areas without going without launching a full-scale war.
Let me put those questions to General Bakshi. Point number one, this isn't localized just to the terrain of the POK. This becomes all-out war. It has very serious economic consequences. India at this moment attracting investment because companies are looking away from China. The moment you're embroiled in war, that no longer is the case. And therefore, given the overall factors, not just military ability to go and take POK, it simply doesn't make sense for India even to be talking about this at this juncture. General Bakshi.
Well, I can put the argument the other way. The simple fact is, what is the state of the Pakistani economy? It is one push away from being flushed down the tube of history. Even if you just engage it in a military arms competition, arms race, you will do what the Americans did to this erstwhile Soviet Union in 1991. It was flushed down the tube of history because of economic collapse. You know, they had put the price of oil in free fall, courtesy the Saudis. In 1 year, 1886, the price of oil had dropped from $30 a barrel to $10 a barrel. It is this which destroyed the Soviet economy, and a nuclear power, you know, was just flushed down the tube without a shot being fired. Let me also put it to you that this is the ideal time if you wanted to put pressure on Pakistan. It was never in more dire straits. It was never in more dire straits. And
no, but the point about the Chinese now being so deeply embedded into the Pakistani economy, especially in Gilgit-Baltistan, especially in the POK region. So you're not just taking on the Pak army. If you were to move militarily, you'd also then have to contend with China.
May I answer that, Rahul?
Yes,
sir. Very pertinent factor you have raised. There is the meteorological factor in the Himalayas. You know, when we went in for Bangladesh, I think we went all out, no holds barred. I was part of that operation. What did the Chinese do? Because Sam Manekshaw had very deliberately had the attack delayed till December. There are met factors which will not allow China to intervene even if it wants to. Did China intervene in 1971? While we went for Bangladesh Jagla? When we captured Dhaka? I mean, let's not exaggerate the enemy's strength so much that we frighten ourselves into impotence.
No, like we're not frightened by anyone. We're just having a rational conversation. Let me put that question to General Hasnain. The China of 71, very different from the China of 22. Now thinking that they're a global superpower whose time has arrived, whose economic, military, offensive capabilities, asymmetric capabilities, very different from the 70s. Do you agree with General Bakshi?
No, I don't agree with General Bakshi for the simple reason that in this entire discussion so far, we haven't discussed the context of the international environment. And is this the environment in which India, leading G20, is looking to go to war to get back POK? No, not at all. We are looking at climate change. We are looking at economic recovery. We are looking at energy security. We are looking at all kinds of non-military aspects at the moment. We are looking at becoming a Vishwaguru. But what I think we are missing out in this entire discussion is the fact that what General Dwivedi was talking about was just one point in the list of contingencies. And if someone has taken note of that across the border, across the line of control, your aim is achieved. Why are we even talking of war fighting? We're not going to war today, tomorrow, or the day after. Let me tell you, let's be very clear on that. Right? But if the message has gone home, and this has been one of India's greatest weaknesses, our inability to convey the message. I'm glad we are conveying the message. I'm glad the Raksha Mantri decided to speak up. I'm glad that the context is being taken up by generals of the Indian Army, like General Dwivedi. The message is being conveyed. The ISI is being asked to wake up and see that this is a different nation, this is a different army. If required to do so, we will go ahead and do it. It's not that we are going to do it today.
Colonel Shukla, do you agree with this contention at least, that it reflects... okay, you want to counter what he's saying? Go ahead, go ahead. Go ahead, General Bakshi, very quickly, please.
Rahul, it's good that we are very realistic about our constraints. I'm afraid even China has constraints, right? Would China want to get into a two-front war? When it wants to take Taiwan, which is its national stated aim, China believes in one strategic direction, right? Right now, that strategic direction is on the east coast, which is the economic powerhouse. If you put yourself in the Chinese shoes, would China be very keen to get into a mess with India when it is, you know, being challenged by the United States to dare, almost by Nancy Pelosi, to come and try and do Taiwan? Yes, offensive operations have their problems. The Russians have had problems. One of the prime lessons to emerge from the Ukraine conflict is that the defensive has taken precedence over the offense. You will lose hell of a lot. And when you have to attack across 80 miles of the ocean, the sea, the Taiwan Straits, I think the Chinese have a much tougher job. Would they like to focus on their job, or would they like to bail the chestnuts of the Pakistanis out of the fire?
No, but what so this does, General Shukla, potentially is, it puts Rawalpindi under pressure. Far from being bombastic about taking over Jammu and Kashmir or creating trouble here, if they start thinking that the Indian army is actually wargaming designs for coming and taking PoK, does it not put the Pak army at least under psychological pressure and the Pak establishment?
Rahul, I'll just put a couple of points for you.
With.
The first of them is very simple. Is sort of Pakistan in a position to take on the Indian army? And that sort of brings up a simple question. The Indian army has, over the preceding decade, thinned out in the overall numbers from the Pakistan frontier and transferred those troops to the China frontier. So there is a, contrary to the war talk thesis, there is a thinning out, a lessening of Indian power on the Pakistan border vis-a-vis the Chinese border. There were earlier twice as many divisions on the Pakistan border as there are on the Chinese border. Now that has become more equal. The second point I would like to place before you is, regardless of what our respected Northern Army commander said, the Prime Minister just a few days ago said that the era of war is over. He is, what messaging exactly do you get from this, where your Northern Army commander is talking about discharging an order to go to war, which is done in very generic terms, and your Prime Minister himself, who's gone on to an international forum, the G20, which is one of the most listened to forums in the world, and said that we're not in a position, or we're not in an era where you go to war. So I just am reluctant to get into a conversation that is talking hypothetically about war when the indications at the macro level are to the opposite effect.
Okay, but Saika Datta, since you've been a journalist, spare also a thought for Lieutenant General Upendra Dwivedi, who's asked a question during a press conference, can you do this? You certainly don't expect him to say, no, it can't be done. In that sense, and to that extent, the general has given a calibrated order, saying as far as the army is concerned, it will carry out any order given by the government of the day. When such an order is given, we will be ready for it. It's the most obvious and appropriate thing for the general to say.
If such an order were to be given, the general will even do his damnedest to implement it as well. But as we discussed, I mean, you also have to look at facts. If such is the case, if the Chinese are so distracted, etc., shouldn't we have cleared them of all the areas instead of talking about 16, 17 rounds and remove them physically or through military means? That's a question that needs to be. We rather should be spending more time looking at the Chinese than worry about the Pakistanis, because as somebody said, Pakistan is almost imploding. We need to look at China, and there on the Chinese front, in the Ladakh area, where they are denied us our claimed areas as of now, as we speak, we haven't removed them from those areas at all.
Okay, final words.
Rahul,
General Bakshi.
Rahul, one quick point.
Yes, Colonel Shukla.
Can I? Yeah.
Just one by one. I'll come to you, General Bakshi, for final words. Colonel Shukla wants to make a quick point, and then I come across to you.
Oh,
Okay.
I'll wait for General G.D. Bakshi
Right.
to finish his thought.
Okay, go on, General Bakshi. Pehle aap.
No, no. All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Rajiv. You know what I just wanted to point out is that any country which is traditionally in a two-front situation, like Germany was in World War I and World War II, always the grand strategic aspect has been they have gone for the weaker side first and then turned around to face the stronger person, the stronger of the two opponents, right? So my point is that given Pakistan's precarious situation, it would not be geostrategic nonsense to plan to give a kind of, even if you give a partial blow, the Pakistan economy will never recover. You know, think of at a much smaller scale, if you are able to pressurize militarily Pakistan in a manner that is even partial, the blow to the Pakistani economy could be terminal. That's all that I want to say.
Okay, Colonel
And
Shukla,
let the
final
people
word, I'm
on
out
the
of time.
opposite side chew on this one.
Okay, I would only put one fact before us. We have had the experience before of seeing Pakistan as a divided house, where the army was actually trying to crack down on militants in the northwest frontier province, where the political parties were at complete loggerheads with each other, and the economy was completely adrift. And all of us said, this is not a country that can face up to India. This is in the doldrums. But lo and behold, the minute India mounts a threat on Pakistan, everybody who's at loggerheads comes together and are united against dealing with the Indian threat. So I don't think India, talking tactically and strategically, will ever face a divided Pakistan, because just by virtue of the fact that the Indian army is going in, that will bring all the various parties in Pakistan together.
Okay.
Add to that the fact that they would get support from China, they would get some support at least from the Gulf countries. This sort of overall rosy, optimistic scenario that we paint dissolves in the face of hard calculations. I don't think we'll ever face a divide.
No, here's what I wish to say in conclusion. You know, for China to go in and take over Taiwan is mighty complex, economically, militarily, diplomatically. But China is constantly talking about taking over Taiwan, putting Taiwan under pressure, letting the world know of its intent. In some ways, in these back-to-back comments, the Indian establishment seems to be suggesting the same. Now, this is not about actually going out and doing it, but it shifts the goalpost from Jammu and Kashmir being up for discussion to PoK being under consideration. At least that's the image and the perception that the Indian government and the army is sending across to the generals in Rawalpindi. And there's a new man in charge, so he has something to think about tonight. This is where I wrap up the first part of our discussion. I want to thank General Hasnain, Colonel Shukla, Major Manik Jolly, Saika Datta, and last but not least, Major General G.D. Bakshi for joining us. General Bakshi raring to have a go and seeming to believe that this can be done, but you've heard different points of view, as is always the case on the Newstrack. I don't tell you what to think. We bring out different points of view and leave it to you, our viewer, to decide where you come out on the question of whether India can take over Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and should it even try at this point in time.